everybody, we're going to explore some plant science with Julia today, and I'm just going to go ahead and jump right in. So Julia, could you introduce yourself and tell us what sort of science you do?
Hi everyone, I'm Julia and I'm a third year graduate student in Dr. Kathleen Kay's Plant Evolution Lab here at the Ecology and Evolutionary Biology Department. We're standing here in a greenhouse full of my plants. I, in general, like to combine modern genomic and genetic techniques with field ecology to answer questions about evolution. That's really my little spot in science.
Very cool. So if you could just sum up your project in 30 seconds, how would you do it?
Ooh, that's a tough one. I would say I study two very closely related neotropical gingers that partition habitat very differently. So they are ecogeographically isolated, meaning that they have different ecological adaptations that result in different geographic distributions. And basically, I'm investigating their differential adaptations to those different habitats and how that plays out in a hybrid zone that we found along the Panamanian Canal.
Interesting. So can you tell us a little bit more about the two species and their habitats?
Absolutely. So this is Costus villicissimus. It is a rapidly growing and actually highly drought tolerant species. It grows on the seasonal side of the Panamanian Isthmus, which is the Atlantic side, which actually has a pronounced dry season of 3 to 6 months. And it also appreciates more light than the other species, so it's sort of more light and more drought adapted, versus this species here is Costus olenii, and this grows on the Caribbean side of the Panamanian Isthmus that gets perennial rain. So it grows in a deeper understory environment that's always wet. And you can see some obvious differences right away, including much broader leaves for capturing more of the light. And it also has thicker leaves and grows much more slowly to generate those sort of more energetically expensive features. Those abiotic differences in their habitat, meaning non-living, so abiotic factors would be precipitation and light, I've found also influence the biotic environment. And so the herbivore environment appears to be fairly different for these two species, and they have different adaptations for that as well. And that's part of my fieldwork investigating different adaptations between these species.
Very cool. So what can you tell us about the hybrid zone? What's going on there?
Hybrid zone is very cool. Basically, it's a relatively intermediate habitat found around the center of the isthmus, where it's getting more rain through the dry season than the actual seasonal side, but does have a bit more seasonality. And it is artificially has more light than some other areas because of the road. There's a road called Pipeline Road that runs along the Panama Canal, and that's where we find these hybrids. So there's some potential anthropogenic influence on how that hybrid zone has formed. And I've collected seed from those hybrids and brought them into the greenhouse here for various genetic reasons. And you can see that compared to the parental species, these hybrids back here are enormous. They're quite vigorous in comparison to their parents. This is often called heterosis or hybrid vigor, and definitely seems to be at play here. Ooh, this is going to bloom soon. That's really exciting. And basically what I've found is that most of these hybrids are 50-50 hybrids, meaning they have about 50% ancestry from one parent and 50 from the other. And this indicates that it's very likely that they are F1 hybrids, meaning mom was one species and dad was another species. It's possible you could get that genetic pattern if a hybrid breeds with another hybrid, two F1s breed, or if there's self-pollination within one, where you have equally 50-50% from each, but it'll be in smaller chunks because of more recombination. And that's something that I'm still investigating. Based on their phenotypes and how consistent they are, though, they really do seem to be F1s. And this indicates that there's strong selection against continued hybridization, and certainly the lack of hybrids and the lack of sort of more introgression or more gene flow between the species deeper into each species' habitat indicates that the selection pressures in those habitats are preventing that movement of genes and maintaining a relatively stable and small hybrid zone, as opposed to one species swamping out the other or some new species formation with that hybrid zone.
So you mentioned earlier that the hybridization you see in the wild might be due to the anthropogenic disturbance of the road. How do you think that anthropogenic climate change might influence the interaction between these species?
That's a great question. I'll start by saying this is all very speculative, but it's one of my favorite things to speculate about. I mentioned that Villosissimus in particular, the big yellow-flowered species that grows in the dry environment, has really pronounced drought adaptation, and it seems to be a very plastic strategy, meaning in years with more or less rain, it can either slow its growth and drop leaves more to prevent evapotranspirative water loss, and in years where there's more rain in the dry season, it could keep those leaves and continue growing. So it's basically able to sort of modify how it's responding based on the water availability. And you can imagine in a climate change scenario, we're going to have more variability in precipitation and more unpredictability in precipitation regimes. So currently, for Costus lenii, which grows in the dark and in this area that has perennial moisture, there's no selection pressure for any kind of drought tolerance. But as the climate shifts, it's very possible that it'll start to experience some periods of drought. Given that these plants are very closely related, diverged only about 1 million years ago, which might sound like a lot, but is a very small amount of time in evolutionary time, they have this ability to interbreed, as we know from the hybrids, and there's the potential that Alenii or other closely related Costus species could sort of co-opt or adopt some of the traits that Villosissimus has that enables it to withstand these periodic droughts. And so there's sort of the potential for rapid evolutionary shifts with big changes in selection pressure, given the availability of these traits in sort of the whole genus gene pool. Again, highly speculative. We don't know if that's how things would work out or what the consequences would be. There's also the possibility that there's not good compatibility between some of the genes controlling traits in Villosissimus and the sort of genetic background of Alenii. So there's many grains of salt there, but it's very fun to think about. So I appreciate the question.
That's very cool. That plasticity in drought tolerance is actually found in my species too. So very interesting.
That's awesome.
Yeah. Thanks for talking about all these cool things, Julia.
My pleasure. Thanks for listening.